Johnny Tremain, Chapter 7, The Fiddler's Bill. But when that bill came, the Fiddler's Bill, that bill for the tea, it was so much heavier than anyone expected. Boston was thrown into a paroxysm of anger and despair. There had been many a moderate man who had thought the tea a bit lawless and was now ready to vote payment for the tea. But when these men heard how cruelly the town was to be punished, they swore it would never be paid for. And those other 13 colonies, up to this time, many of them had little interest in Boston's struggles. Now they were united as never before. The punishment united the often jealous, often indifferent, separate colonies, as the Tea Party itself had not. Sam Adams was so happy his hands shook worse than ever, for it had been voted in far-off London that the port of Boston should be closed. Not one ship might enter. Not one ship might leave the port, except only His Majesty's warships and transports, until the tea was paid for. Boston was to be starved into submission. On that day, that 1st of June, 1774, Johnny had Rab, like almost all the other citizens, did no work, but wandered from place to place over the town. People were standing in angry knots, talking, gesticulating, swearing that yes, they would starve. They would go down to ruin rather than give in now. Even many of the Tories were talking like that, for the punishment fell equally heavily upon the king's most loyal subjects in Boston and on the very Indians who had tossed the tea overboard. This closing of the port of Boston was indeed tyranny. This was oppression. This was the last straw upon the back of many a moderate man. The boys strolled the waterfront. Here on Long Wharf, merchants counting houses were closed and shuttered. Sail lofts deserted. The riggers and porters stood idle. Overnight, hundreds of such and sailors and rope makers, wharfingers and dock hands had been thrown out of work. The great ships of Boston, which had been bringing wealth for over 100 years, were idle at their berths. Not one might come and go. At first it was the men of the ships and wharves that were thrown out of work and could not get food for their families. The paralysis that started there would soon spread out and include everybody. For who now could buy new clothes? The clothers and tailors would close shop. Not one man in Boston could afford a silver basin. The silversmiths would not last long. Nobody could pay rent. The wealthy landowners were headed for bankruptcy. So, said Rab cheerfully, looks like we'd all starve together. They stood at the very end of Long Wharf, which ran half a mile out into the harbor. They could see the Captain, British flagship, stationed between Long and Hancock's Wharf, and over by Governor's Island, the Lively, and beyond the Mercury and the Magdalen, the Tartar. His Majesty's fleet surrounded Boston, enforcing the Port Act. Uncle Lorne is upset. He says the printers will not be able to go on with the newspapers. He won't be able to collect subscriptions or get any advertising. He won't be able to buy paper nor ink. He's sending the Webb twins home. Yes, back to Chelmsford, but he and I can manage. The Observer is to be half size. He won't give up. He'll keep on printing about our wrongs and our rights until he drops dead at his press or gets hanged. There had been a good deal of talking about hanging. Governor Hutchinson was ordered to England. General Gage from now on would be in charge. Regiment upon regiment of the finest British troops were arriving. They were planning to put down sedition all right, and everyone knew that Gage had the right to send any man whom he believed a leader in this revolt against England to London, and the parody of a trial, certain death on the gallows. Or if he wished, Gage might erect his gallows over here. Sam Adams and Hancock, Dr. Warren, perhaps still James Otis, would be the first to go. Certainly, all the other members of the Observers, if ever their names were known, would follow, and so would all the Whig printers of Boston. No wonder Uncle Lorne was a little nervous. By nature, he was a timid man. Yet timid or bold, he would go on printing, begging the people of Massachusetts to wake up and resist this tyranny before it was too late. He would print until he had not a sheet of paper left to print on, or until the very day the gallows was set up for him. As yet, only the British men of war had arrived, but the transports were on the seas. Soon it seemed that almost every day another transport put in. There was the rattle of drums, with the shouts of officers, and off the ships poured a flood, scarlet as a tide of blood. Boston was inundated with British soldiers, and now every third person one met in the street wore the handsome uniform of King George III. There wasn't much work to do. Rab by himself could set the entire newspaper in a day. The subscriptions had dropped, partly because many people could not afford a paper, and partly because so many Whig families were leaving Boston for the country. Johnny could deliver the Boston papers. In a morning, instead of taking all day, June was ending in the days, and the boys stood about the common, watching the soldiers of the 1st Brigade camped there under Earl Percy. Row upon row of identical tents, cook fires, tethered horses of officers, camp followers, stacked muskets, the quick, smart pacing of sentries. All was neat and orderly. Muskets. It was the muskets which interested Rab the most. Already on every village green throughout New England, men and boys were drilling in defiance of the king's orders. They said they were afraid of an attack from the French. These men had no uniforms. They came from the fields and farms in the very clothes they used for plowing. That was all right, but the weapons they brought to their drilling were not. Many had ancient flintlocks, old squirrel guns handed down for generations. Rab, for instance, all that spring had been going to Lexington once or twice a week to drill with his fellow townsmen. But he could not beg nor buy a decent gun. He drilled with an old fowling piece his grandsire had given him to shoot ducks on the Concord River. Never had Johnny seen Rab so bothered about anything as he was over his inability to get himself a good modern gun. "I don't mind their shooting at me," he would say to Johnny, "and I don't mind shooting at them. But God give me a gun in my hands that can do better than knock over a rabbit at 10 feet. The British soldiers went about their business, as though oblivious of the many hostile, curious eyes watching them. They were confident that these provincials, these yokels, now gaping at their equipment, gauging the manner of fighting men they were, would be so impressed they would never stand up and fight them. Rab, so concerned over a gun as he was, did an uncharacteristic, foolish thing. The 2 boys were standing close to a stack of muskets. As Rab explained to Johnny their good points, he put out a hand and touched the lock on one. Without even showing bad temper, almost impartially, a mounted officer sitting his horse close by chatting with a couple of Boston's Tory girls, swung about and struck Rab a heavy blow on the side of his head with the flat of his sword. Then he went on flirting with the girls as though nothing had happened. Rab never knew what hit him. Now a sergeant came bawling, "Spectators are not to intrude. Get back behind them ropes. Get back, all of you. Get back." Johnny stayed where he was beside the unconscious Rab. Yet after this act of sudden violence, the boys were well treated. Johnny was not run through because he stayed with his friend, did not obey the sergeant. A gray older man, a medical officer, approached, called for water, sponged Rab's face for him, and said he was coming too. Johnny was not to worry. What was he doing? Just looking at a gun. Touching it? Well, yes, and only got hit over the head. He got off easy. Filching a soldier's arm is a serious misdemeanor. Wonder Lieutenant Bragg didn't kill him. Rab said thickly, "I hadn't thought to filch it. Not bad idea. Guess I'll. He was still groggy from the blow. "If I ever get a chance, I'll." The medical man only laughed at him. "Now, boys," he said seriously, "you forget talk like that. You remember that we don't like being here in Boston any better than you like having us. I'd rather be with my wife and children in Bath. We're both in a tight spot. But if we keep our tempers and you keep your tempers, why, we can fix up things between us somehow. We're all one people, you know." As he talked, Johnny had an experience he was to have many more times. The troops would do something he considered unforgivable, like nearly braining Rab for merely touching a gun, and then the next moment be so civil and friendly. He could not help but like them, at least some of them, as individuals. The medical man, noticing Johnny's riding boots and spurs, was saying, "I have a cousin, lives over in Cambridge. Haven't had a chance to send him a letter. Do either of you know a boy with a good horse who'd ride for me?" Rab was mouthing, "Yes," at Johnny. "I've got a good horse. Come to me at 1 o'clock sharp this noon. I'm quartered on Mr. Shaw, North Square." On the way home, Rab said, If you can't get started carrying messages for him, others may follow. If you can get started carrying messages for him, others may follow. Might be we could learn things Sam Adams and Dr. Warren and Paul Revere would like to know. They wouldn't dare send their own orderlies, fearful somebody might kill them. I thought of that myself. About 1 o'clock, as he stood beside Goblin in North Square receiving money and the letter from the medical captain, also a pleasant smile, one thing upset him. Paul Revere's house was almost next door. There was a girl there about his age. She was standing before her house, almost bent horizontal at the hips. She was sticking out at him the longest, reddest tongue he had ever seen. And as he mounted and swung about to leave the British officer, he held her smiling in a horrible sing-song. He loves the British, he loves the British. But that night on his return, when he went to tell Mr. Revere, there was no question about that Mr. Shirtliff of Cambridge, always considered a lukewarm Whig, was in reality a leader of Tories in Middlesex County. He was little Miss Revere again. He saw little Miss Revere again. Father says, she apologized handsomely, that I'm not to believe everything I see, and believe anything you like. Johnny was feeling good. He had charged the medical man 3 times the price he would have dared charge a Yankee, and by what Mr. Shirtleaf had said to his wife on reading this letter, he had found out something worth not much, but at least worth knowing. I like to see you stick out your tongue, he went on. It is so long and red, I thought at first it was a hound dog dressed up in pink petticoats. I never guessed it was a young lady. Now Johnny no longer kept half the money he and Goblin earned carrying letters. He charged the British officers such a figure, and they never complained. He was bringing in a considerable sum, and he gave it all to Aunt Lauren to buy food for her family, of which he was one. At first she wouldn't take it. Then she cried and kissed him on the little peak of hair that turned down upon his forehead, and did take it. No gallows was set to hang rebels. General Gage was doing his best to make friends with the people of Boston. He did not stop the flood of treasonable oratory which poured forth from men like Warren and Quincy. He did not prohibit the publication of such inflammatory presses as the Observer. The Whigs had their say. The papers were allowed to print outrageous things about himself and his troops. He was not brilliant, but he was no tyrant. In time he confidently expected all the trouble would smooth out by itself, if only the soldiers and the inhabitants did not get to quarreling. Nor did Boston starve. From one end of the Atlantic seaboard to the other, towns and even villages sent great shipments of food, rice from South Carolina, or quintals of fish from Marblehead, money even from London, for there was much sympathy in England for Boston. Flour, corn, beef, sheep, all day were passing through the town gates upon the neck, in carts and wagons. This was the only road connecting Boston with the mainland. Formerly, almost everything she used came to her on hundreds of famous ships. Now the ships were lying like dead birds along her wharves. So July was ending. Johnny had not seen Priscilla Lapham for 3 weeks. His schedule was now so much upset, he never did know when he would be in North Square on a Thursday. And every Sunday of late he had gone out to Lexington to watch the Minutemen drilling, a little secretly behind Grandshire's Silsby's great barn. It might be Sabbath breaking, but these men were so sure they were doing God's will and preparing to resist tyranny, they did not care. Johnny could only stand and watch. True enough, there were boys no older than he drilling there, but his crippled hand made it impossible for him to pull a trigger. This incapacity fretted him badly, and he would sometimes take it out on Rab. The militia troops didn't look like much. They had funny-looking guns. They were funny-looking men, and Rab let him talk. He knew why Johnny was criticizing. It was because he could not be one himself. So he had not seen Cilla since late in June. Thus far, she had never once come to the Observer's office in Salt Lane. It was as if she recognized it as that other world into which Johnny Tremain had disappeared, and knew that she could not follow him. So Johnny was surprised one afternoon, riding back from Plymouth, where he had delivered a letter for Major Pitcairn, to find her sitting in the shop with Rab. She did not look at all forlorn in her fresh lavender muslin frock, her neat white stockings, and black pumps. Her head was tipped back, and she was laughing. She had been drawing a picture, and Rab was telling her what to draw. For once, for the first time since Johnny had left the Laphams, Santa was not with her. Johnny was so glad to see her. He wondered, could it have been that it was a Santa always hanging on to her, always showing off, that had irritated him, made him not care whether he kept his rendezvous with the girls or not? As he came in, booted and spurred, sunburned and hatless, Cilla glanced at him. Her eyes were happy, filled to the brim with happiness. She had been having such a good time with Rab, and unconsciously and unreasonably Johnny stiffened. He couldn't see why she and Rab should have been having such a good time. They were explaining. Rab had wanted a picture of Boston being strangled to death by a British grenadier. It was for the newspaper, and she, Cilla, having chanced in, had drawn it beautifully. Now Johnny would have to cut a block of it for printing. I can do it. Not very well, of course, but I can. You certainly can draw better and better. Mr. Tweedy can draw. He's given me lessons, and Rab posed for the British Grenadier. Look, I have pictures of him here. Those, Rab? They look more like woodchucks than Rab to me, he said, but Cilla knew he thought they were fine pictures and was proud of her. She was so pretty Johnny could hardly think where all this prettiness came from, and sourly he thought it came from Rab. He had a way of lighting people up, showing them at their best. No, partly at least it was because of that lavender dress, and her face had color in it because she was eating enough. When the troops came and times were so hard, Cilla had always given a large share of her food to Asana, and had grown to look more peaked and worried every week. Now she looked fine. Sit there like that, Johnny. I'm going to draw you too. You're easier than Rab. Why am I easier than Rab? Because, she said, intentionally hurting his feelings. You're just a child yet. Rab's grown up. There. You don't mind if I make you look a little like a raccoon, do you? I'll draw a bushy tail for you, Cilla, Rab said. Johnny fidgeted, as people do who are having their pictures drawn. Crazy to see what somebody else thinks they look like. It wasn't much of a picture. Between them, they had drawn a funny, half raccoon, half boy. Somehow it did look like Johnny, and they all laughed. 4 o'clock. I must be getting back. I was told to pick up a pair of gloves on Queen Street and be back at 5. She got up, tied a flower bonnet on her head, and started for the door. Wait, Cilla, you haven't told me any news. He had forgotten how recently her news had bored him. That's right. I've just told Rab. Johnny, I won't be able to meet you regular anymore. Things have changed. How so? Your mother mad? No, that is, yes, she is mad. But about something else. She's mad because Dorcas really did have the guts to run off and marry Fritzl Jr., just as soon as Mr. Tweedy declared for her. Dorcas isn't going to get much of that elegance she was always out after from Fritzl Jr. No, but she doesn't care. The young girl's voice softened. She says when you really are in love, you don't care much about anything except him. Johnny, remembering the gawky, callow, but upstanding young leather dresser of Fish Street, was surprised that anyone could value him so highly. She ran off with Fritzl Jr. just as soon as Mr. Tweedy came out and said he preferred her to Madge. But what put Ma right through the roof was when he said he was in no hurry. He didn't mind passing up Madge and waiting for me. You? Cried Johnny hotly. That old man? If he is a man, why? He must be about 40, Cilla. You're lying to me if you say anybody's talking about marrying you. I was 15 last month, and you were 15 way back in January. I had not stopped to think, Rab. Did you hear that? I'm only a year younger than you are now. Rab grinned. I was 17 last week. Johnny thought that was like Rab slipping off by himself, getting ahead of you and then grinning at you out of the corner of his mouth. Mother didn't like it. Mr. Tweedy stalling like that. Then one thing happened after another. For instance, ever since, well, last fall, the lights have been giving us work to do. Mr. Tweedy is clever, although so queer. A couple of weeks ago, Miss Light came in. She wanted her arms, the old rising sun, engraved on the top of her riding whip. So she stands about, and I stand about, and Mr. Tweedy and Ma. The shop door was open into the backyard, and Asana was standing about too, in the backyard. I'll bet she was. Yes, Miss Laphams just about had a fit. What was Asana doing? Throwing up? I had just washed her hair, Cilla said dreamily, and the sun was on it. Oh, I see, said Johnny sourly. And Asana was walking back and forth, reciting some poetry to herself, acting it out. Something about Captain Kidd and how he sailed. Old Stumpy Joe, the one-legged sailor man, taught it to her. Miss Laphams stood there watching Asana, and she looked more like something cut out of stone than a human being. She can't help it, said Johnny, who liked to run her down. She was born that way. Go on. She just turned her head like that and said to Ma through her teeth like this, Ma'am, I'm taking that child with me. Ma first said she wouldn't, and then she said she couldn't stand between Asana and such an opportunity, and Asana said she wouldn't go without me. So it was fixed this way. I'm signed up to work in the kitchen or help Miss Laphams dress or anything for a year, and Asana is thrown in for nothing. Because she is so young and has a delicate stomach, we are both living with the lights. Do you like her? Sometimes. Well, yes. Well, I think she's disagreeable. He hoped Cilla would contradict him, but she did not. So now I'll be going back. She only gave me the afternoon off. I thought I'd tell you not to look for me around North Square anymore. Johnny felt guilty. I do leave a paper at the lights every Thursday. Cilla said nothing, but looked at him out of the corners of her eyes. Couldn't I see you sometime, maybe? I don't know. You might ask Mrs. Bessie, the cook. She's sort of a friend of mine. So goodbye. I'll be going on. Cilla had changed so much Johnny felt confused. One thing was certain. She wasn't going to hang around and wait for him either on street corners or at back doors, and then not have him show up. Goodbye, Cilla. I'll see you soon. But Rab did not say goodbye. He did not even ask if he might walk home with her to Beacon Hill. He simply went, and Johnny was mad. If anyone walked home with Cilla, it should be himself, or Rab might have said, "Come on, Johnny, we'll both walk over to the lights," with Cilla. But he'd forgive Rab for intruding himself. He'd cook him up a mess of eggs for supper. It would take about 15 minutes to go to the lights, 15 minutes to get back. He built the fire and cooked the eggs. He cooked them and cooked them. At last, in disgust, he took them off and ate them, every now and then going down to consult the shop clock. Rab was gone for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes, nor did he miss the eggs Johnny had eaten. He had been very, very well fed by Mrs. Bessie in the light kitchen, and he thought Cilla was a grand kid. He had a good time. You could see it in his eyes, and whenever he looked at Johnny's long face, he looked ready to laugh. Now, the only regularity in Johnny's life was the great effort he made to see Cilla every Thursday, and the care he gave to Goblin. But when he went to the Afric Queen, he was going into enemy territory. The tavern had been taken over bodily by British officers, chief among whom was Colonel Francis Smith. Goblin was the only horse in the stable that did not belong to a British officer, for the landlord had sent his to the country, fearing they would either be commandeered by the occupying troops or that he could not get hay for them. About the stables, British orderlies, officers, servants, and small British horseboys, the servants of the servants, were always congregating. Johnny paid little heed to them. They all knew that he rode for the Observer, but they also knew that he often rode for their own officers. Sometimes they picked on him, and once, when the things got too bad, and he felt he had to fight it out with the worst bully, the other boys, all his enemies, stood about demanding fair play, saying, "Well fought, Yankee," and that's neat when he beat the bully. He had rather thought the whole gang would be on him the second he got the bully down. Instead, they merely respected him, so he made out better than he could have expected, until one day he found that Colonel Smith had a new horseboy. The one he had brought over with him had run away, so he had told his orderly officer to find a new one, and that boy was Dove. Johnny saw him grinning sheepishly at him, hoping they might be friends. They, the only two local boys at the stable. "You," Johnny muttered out of the corner of his mouth. "You trash, you milk pudding, you cottage cheese slug. So you're not above going to work for them, are you?" "Honest, Johnny, I gotta eat. Old Tweety fired me." An orderly stuck his head in the stable. "Boy," he said to Johnny, "Colonel Smith has a letter to go to Milton. Please go to the parlor and see him or Lieutenant Stranger about it." A slow gat-toothed grin spread over Dove's face. "Looks like you work for them too." "Looks like," said Johnny fiercely. He saw the colonel, went home for his boots and spurs, then took out Goblin and saddled him. One of the English boys had got Dove down and was twisting his arm, making him swear allegiance to his Britannic Majesty, gracious George III. Dove was swearing fast enough and protesting that was the way he really felt. All rebels should be hung. Johnny had a queer feeling at the pit of his stomach. He wanted to go to his rescue. He had to make himself remember that he hated Dove. But that fellow over there, Dove was pointing to Johnny, is really on the other side, and Johnny left Dove to his fate. It was a crisp, fresh day for summer, the first respite after a week of unendurable heat. Goblin felt fine. He came sidling out of the stable, dancing and playing. Johnny let him move about, got the kinks out. He loved the horse. He loved the admiration he saw on every face, grooms dropping curry combs, officers looking out of windows and talking to each other and nodding toward Goblin. Chambermaids, rich Tory gentlemen, all stopped to stare when Goblin played. Although he mostly kept his eyes on Goblin's wickedly flattened ears, it is the only way you can tell which way a horse will jump next. He did notice a thick red face at the parlor window, Colonel Smith, and he heard his booming voice. "Boy, one moment." Doubtless he had changed his mind about that letter for Milton. Lieutenant Stranger, his orderly officer, was coming out of the parlor. He had on no hat, his spurs were in his hand. He was a dark young fellow, not much older than Rab, and something in both his color and carriage had always made Johnny think of Rab. "That's quite a horse you have there." "He's all right." "Well, we sort of hate to see a damned Yankee on top of a good horse like that. How much will you take?" He belongs to my master, Mr. Lorne. Colonel Smith, he called to the stiff, red face at the window. This horse belongs to Lorne, the printer, Boston Observer, you know. We can commandeer him, all right. You fix a proper price? So, boy, how much will your master take for him? He's not for sale. Oh, he isn't, is he? You know damn little about the rights of His Majesty's Armed Forces. You get off, and I'll try him around the block and see how I think he would suit Colonel Smith. He knelt and buckled on his spurs. The handsome black washerwoman of the inn, Lydia, came out carrying a hamper of wet clothes. Johnny had an idea. All right, Lieutenant Stranger, he said politely. Put the stirrups down a couple notches. Now hand me my gloves. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Goblin was watching out of the corner of his crystalline blue eyes. Not for months had anyone but Johnny Tremain been on his back. But the lieutenant mounted confidently, picked up the reins, and held them exactly as Goblin liked. The horse moved quietly out of the inn yard. Colonel Smith's face disappeared from the parlor window. Lydia, said Johnny as he strolled over to the washerwoman, I'll help you with those clothes. She gave him a dazzling smile. My land, Johnny boy, I could do with a bit of help. Them Britishers expect a clean sheet every week and seems like a clean shirt every day. Johnny gravely pinned a couple of shirts on the line, his mouth, like Lydia's, full of wooden clothespins. The ruffled shirts began snapping smartly in the breeze. Sheets? We've got 17 officers staying with us. We got sheets by the dozen. Look, Lydia, you lend me a sheet for just a few moments. If I get it dirty, I'll wash it. And besides, I'll hang up every sheet in your basket. Boy, I don't know what you're up to, and I suspect no good. You'll do as I say. If it's that Lieutenant Stranger what's took your horse away from you, I'll do plenty. He wants to commandeer Goblin for his colonel. We don't know commandeer, but it sounds dreadful cruel to me. It is a way you cook things, said Johnny soberly. My land, boy, don't you let them cook that pretty horse of yours. I'll cook them first. Now look, we've got to stand fairly near to the driveway like this. You get on that end of the sheet and I on this, and we'll let her fill up with wind. Wait, he's coming back, so now, let go. Lydia, quick, let go. The sheet bellowed out like a sail when Lydia let go. Goblin quickly recognized Stranger's skill and goodwill and behaved admirably. The lieutenant thought he'd advise his colonel to pay a pretty fancy price for such a choice beast. Colonel Smith, a timid horseman, liked showy mounts. This one was showy, all right, with his strange pale coat and mane and tail like mahogany. He was young and high-strung. Stranger believed he himself would have to ride him for the next month to get him gentle enough for a superior. But his gaits were like dancing. Let me see, he was thinking. I'll offer Lorne. And then the whole earth blew up from under him, and he hit him a terrific blow on his seat. There was a splash as well. He had landed in a pud muddle. The horse was disappearing into the stable. He got up, ruefully looked at his white breeches, shrugged, and walked over to where Johnny was diligently pinning up sheets. Both he and Lydia had their backs discreetly turned. Well, he said to Johnny belligerently. Yes, sir? I notice your horse worries a bit over blown paper in the streets. Things like that? I suppose you know that, too. Yes, sir. Take those damn clothespins out of your mouth and turn around and answer me. Once the clothespins were out of his mouth, it was hard not to laugh. Answer you what, sir? You flapped that sheet on purpose just for the fun of seeing me sit in a puddle in and to keep my horse out of the army. Oh, you, said Stranger, pretending to be angry, but Johnny knew that at heart he was not. Colonel Smith's great red face once more appeared. How do you ride, Lieutenant? Gad, sir, what? Where's the horse, sir? What have you been mucking about in? Mud puddle, sir, I fell off. He made no effort to excuse himself. Beast vicious, eh? No, sir, just a mite jumpy. No good for army work, nor even just hacking about Boston. But that damn boy, how does he manage? It's his horse, sir. Thanks, Lieutenant. You can look elsewhere for me. The head went in. The stranger was stretching himself lightly. I'll drink my beer standing up for a few days, he said to no one in particular. Then, as an afterthought, beer? Hi, kitchen, he yelled. In the arrogant way Johnny noticed the young officers always called for service. 2 tankards of beer, out here in the yard. He turned to Johnny. What's your horse's name? Goblin. We'll drink to Goblin. Pot boy, give that tankard to this young man. You know, of course, there's no real cure for a horse that shies as badly as that. I've been told he'll never be gentle. If he was as good as he looks, I'd hate to guess what he'd be worth. As it is, I'd not give 15 shillings for him, except, and he smiled, and suddenly, for myself to ride. Have you schooled him in jumping? No, we're not fancy riders over here. At the foot of the common, you'll find a series of hurdles we've put up. If it happens you are over there sometime when I am, I'll show you a bit." "Thank you, sir." "Does he still throw you sometimes?" "Sometimes. I'd have gone off fast enough when that sheet let loose." "That sheet, haha, that was a trick. That was good, that was fine. Hi, you black wench, you finish this beer for me and take the tankards back to the kitchen." And off he stalked, still chuckling to himself. Beginning with that day when Goblin had tumbled Lieutenant Stranger in the mud, Johnny had no more trouble with the British stable boys. When it became hard for him to get the oats and hay for Goblin, they told him he might use theirs. But Dove, who was always swearing allegiance to England, and Johnny knew that he honestly was a Tory, was the butt of all their jokes. Dove clung to Johnny like a drowning man, and Johnny did protect him. He could not help himself, so Dove began oozing into his life. He spent most of his free time at the Observer's office and was always complaining, always gorging himself on the scarce food, and bored both Johnny and Rab. But Rab said, and Johnny knew this was true, sometime the British would not stay tamely shut up in Boston. Sometime they'd strike out and seize the military supplies they knew the provincials were collecting. A colonel's horse boy might very well know a day or so, or even a few hours before a colonel marched. It was up to Johnny to keep in touch with Dove. It was all right for Rab to talk. Rab was training with the armed forces. But what could Johnny do? Not much, it seemed to him, except be bored to death for his country. As he came back from Milton, riding the long, lonely stretch of the Neck, with the gallows and the town gates still before him, Johnny realized how long ago it was that he had burned his hand, and how he hated Dove when he found out the part he had played in that accident. How he had sworn to get even with him. The lying hypocrite telling old Mr. Lapham that all he had meant to do was to teach a pious lesson. Now as he saw Dove daily about the Afric Queen, he could hardly remember this feeling of hatred, his oaths of vengeance. Seemingly hatred and desire for revenge do not last long. He had made new friends. The old world of the Lapham shop and house was gone. Yet he remembered old Mr. Lapham, who had died that spring, with more affection than when he had been serving under him. Even Mrs. Lapham now did not seem so bad. Poor woman, how she had struggled and worked for that good, plentiful food, the clean shirts her boys had worn, the scrubbed floors and polished brass. No, she had never been the ogress he had thought her a year ago. There never had been a single day when she had not been the first up in the morning. He, like a child, had thought this was because she liked to get up. Now he realized that there must have been many a day when she was as anxious to lay abed as Dove himself. He remembered when there was no money to buy meat, and how she would go from stall to stall until she found a butcher who would accept payment by a new clasp of his pocketbook, or a fishwife who would exchange a basket of salt herrings for a black mourning ring. Her bartering and bickering had then seemed small-minded to him. Now he was enough older to realize how valiantly she had fought for those under her care. True, Madge would make another of those big-fisted, hardy women, but women can be worse than that. He thought with some pity of Dorcas and her craving for elegance. Was she never, no, not once, to eat off china? Always nothing but pewter? Poor girl, she'd not lived too high with Fritzl Jr., but Johnny wished her well. Priscilla Lapham, ever since Rab had taken her home and left Johnny to eat 6 fried eggs by himself, he had felt differently about Cilla. She had been his best friend during the years he worked at the Laphams, and then for some months she had been a drag on him. He had not bothered much with her. Overnight, that had changed. He was always looking forward to Thursday and the seed cakes and the half-hour sitting out under the fruit trees with Cilla. And sometimes he would see Miss Laphina light. Then Johnny would hold his breath a moment and enjoy the chill that went up his spine. His feelings for Santa had changed too, and not for the better. It would break Cilla's heart if the little girl did not live up to her lovely face. But Johnny had not liked it that last Thursday, when he had been sitting on the back stoop with Cilla and Miss Laphina, and driven up in her smart whiskey with a red coat beside her and a Santa wedged in between. It could not be possible Santa had not seen him, but she had glanced at him and then looked away. Johnny rode through the town gates, telling his business to the British sentries there, then went first to report to Paul Revere. A family of Tories in Milton wished to move into Boston, and had written Colonel Smith about his move. Although a great many of the Whig families were moving out of the town, a great many Tories, frightened by the rough treatment They were getting in the inland towns, were moving in to be under the protection of the British troops. Then as he had been thinking about the Laphams all the way over from Roxbury, Johnny decided to stop in and see them. He had not been in this house once since Mrs. Lapham and Mr. Tweedy had been so ready to cast them off for the sake of Mr. Light's patronage. The squeak pig was alone in the shop. He had not so much as one boy to help him with his fires or to sweep his shop. He liked to work alone. Johnny saw that he was mending the silver hilt of a British officer's sword. "What are you doing here?" he muttered crossly at Johnny. Johnny took off his spurs and showed the silversmith a broken roll. "I want you to fix that for me this afternoon, Mr. Silversmith." "Yes, sir, yes indeed." Once Johnny was a patron. The past was forgiven him. "If you'll take a chair, it shall be mended in 15 minutes. Johnny couldn't help it. He said poorly, "In 10 minutes, Mr. Silversmith." "In 10 minutes, sir." He walked into the kitchen. There was nobody about. He could smell bread rising. He looked in the birth and death room. It was once more used for storage. It seemed strange beyond belief that he had ever lain so long in that room. And in a way he had died in that room. At least something had happened, and the bright little silversmith's apprentice was no more. He stood here again at the threshold, but now he was somebody else. Then he went outside to the little backyard with the coal house, the privy, and the old willow. Underneath the willow sat a British sergeant of marines with Madge Lapham in his arms. He had rather guessed the Laphams would side with the Tories, but this was fraternizing with the troops at a great rate. The sergeant was not half as big as Madge, but he was holding her in his lap. It is hard to hold even a small child very long in such a position. Johnny thought the sergeant must be very tough. They heard his feet and both looked up at him. Johnny laughed, as did the sergeant and Madge. She said, "Just so it isn't mother," and she twisted and yearned down into her small liver's eyes. The bigger they come, thought Johnny, the harder they fall. Madge certainly likes that sergeant. "Sergeant dear," she said, "I'd like to make you acquainted with an old friend of the family. But, Johnny, how you have grown. I don't know whether to introduce you as Johnny or Mr. Tremain." Johnny had grown. Much of the last year had been spent out of doors and on horseback, and now he was always out in the sun and wind. "Just Johnny." "Sergeant Gale, dear, this is Johnny Tremain." They both agreed they were glad to meet. Gale, whose legs must have been badly cramped, picked up Madge as though she were a pet cat and sat her down beside him. The little man must be prodigiously strong, thought Johnny. He liked his ugly, lined face. He looked just about as tough as they come, even in the Marines. Madge, whom he had always liked the least of the Lapham girls, was rosy, glowing, and beaming. He had always heard that love was a wonderful thing. If it could make Madge Lapham so pleasant, he was ready to agree. "Sit down, Johnny, and tell us about yourself." "There's not much to say. I'm making out. Isn't it a Santa and luck? Taken right into the family like a little sister. Like a pet poodle dog," Johnny said firmly. "My, you haven't changed much. You always were sort of jumping on other people." "I still jump. How's Mrs. L?" "Don't mention her," said Sergeant Gale. "Ma says I've got to marry Mr. Tweedy. He doesn't want to, and I don't want to. Oh, Johnny, you're too young to understand, and I guess Ma's so old she's forgotten. I can't marry Mr. Tweedy. Not since I met Sergeant Gale." "I'll say not," said the Marine. "Madge, in case you've been wondering, is going to marry me. Aren't you? You two some plump suet pudding?" The skinny little red rascal evidently liked his ladies plump. Johnny went back to the shop, paid Mr. Tweedy for his work, and buckled on his spurs. He had enjoyed his visit to the Laphams. Mr. Tweedy had bowed to him, called him sir, and rubbed his hands in gratitude for even this small favor. Madge so pleasant, and the smell of Ma's good bread rising. Goblin, tied to the head of the wharf, was pawing, turning toward him and nickering. As he settled himself in the saddle, and the horse moved off down Fish Street, he thought it had been a nice visit, but he would not go again. That was all over. Mrs. Bessie, that monstrous fine woman who cooked for the lights, always had an eye out Thursday afternoons for Johnny, and she usually could manage that Cilla was free then, for she was housekeeper as well as cook. This Thursday, as Johnny drew up, she shook her head. "You come in, Johnny, but I guess today you'll have to put up with just me. Your little sweetheart," Johnny's stomach turned over, "will be needed in the parlor. We've got 9 or 10 of those British officers in there, and Miss Lapham wants to put on a good show for them." Johnny had often noticed before how disrespectful Mrs. Bessie spoke of Lapham, and she was always telling Cilla that she needn't jump so fast when the bell rang for her. Let her blow her own nose for once, she said. Johnny knew that it was no good omen that the old woman had no loyalty toward her mistress, whom she had known since her motherless infancy. In his heart, he knew there was something unlikable about Laphams Light. Bessie knew what it was, and Cilla now knew, but she wouldn't tell him. Now, when he wanted to talk about Mrs. Light, she would veil her eyes and look at him from out of the corners and say nothing. But he knew Cilla knew. All day in the parlor, fixing up to go to a ball at the province house General Gage is giving tonight. Masquerade. Miss Laphams is going like the Black Queen of Spades, and all her special admirers are going as kings or knaves or jokers, out of the pack. Is Santa's going too? Is Santa? Yep, where Miss goes these days, that child goes too. Izzy. No one had ever before called the little girl this. Goes dressed up as a two-spot holding up Miss Laphams' train. Cilla shot into the kitchen, looking bright and excited. Johnny, I thought you might be here. They are trying to make a scepter for the Queen of Spades out of 10. I told them you could do it. Miss Laphams said, show 'em in. The elegant dove gray, lavender, and yellow drawing room was in what Miss Laphams would call a state. The officers seemed to have counted on their ladies' help with their costumes, but they also brought with them a military tailor who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, stitching at the black and yellow striped jerkin for a knave. Miss Laphams looked half in and half out of her costume as Queen of Spades. For a moment, Johnny was confused. It was not because she had less clothing on than he was accustomed to, but because she was so beautiful. He had never seen her so happy, so animated before. She was laughing hilariously as she attempted to fasten two flat surfaces of cardboard painted with two spots onto a Santa, but Santa had on nothing but her undershift, her little pink legs bare to the middle thigh. Ma would have died if she saw her daughter like this. Johnny did not care about that, but he could not bear to think of poor old Mr. Lapham turning over in his grave. Johnny paid no attention to the hilarious Miss Light. He went up to Asana. Look here, girl. You go upstairs and you put some clothes on. Asana stared at him, her beautiful soft brown eyes so blank she looked almost blind. You know your grandpa is just about flopping over and over in his grave. You weren't brought up to act like this. Asana said, I'm too young to be lascivious. She was evidently repeating what she had heard some adult say. Johnny slapped her, not for himself, but for her grandpa. She went down in a heap, unpended over a pile of finery brought down from the attic. While standing up, it was possible she did not have on quite enough clothes for mixed company, but unpended, she did not look to have on any. Then everyone began to laugh. Laphams was wiping her eyes. Lieutenant Stranger, for it was he who picked the child up, was reduced to a painful gasp. Oh, oh, oh. There was a major in a corner who was vowing he was going to die. Only the military tailor never lifted his eyes, but went on with his stitching. Oh, Johnny, Miss Laphams managed at last, for the first time calling him by name. Will you come to the ball and slap all the ladies you think are underdressed? Oh, la, I burst a string. Give me, Cilla, fetch. Cilla evidently knew what would be wanted. She came running with smelling salts, but she got it too close to her mistress' nose. Miss Laphams was gagging. Oh, you stupid, stupid girl. You half killed me. There, take it away. As Santa ran up and hid her flushed face in Miss Laphams' lap, she was half frightened at the attention she had been receiving and half squirming with delight at being at the center of so many eyes. As Miss Laphams was scolding one sister for a clumsy servant, she was fondling the flying, soft yellow hair of the other. Suddenly, Johnny saw red. He hated Miss Laphams and the giggling officers and Asana. He had already guessed that the two sisters were treated very differently, but he had not before actually seen the situation with his own two eyes. Cilla had backed out of the picture, standing aside, ready to serve if called upon, or ready to be of no more importance than a piece of furniture if not spoken to. Johnny went to her. Cilla, he said, don't you stay here any more. I don't want you to. These people are nothing, just a pack of playing cards. Tear them up and get out. And that goes for the whole collection of them, Miss Laphams and Izzy too. Miss Light had regained her composure. I will not have Asana called Izzy by my servants. I'm not your servant, and if she acts like an Izzy, she gets called an Izzy. But as I was saying, Cilla, I will not have my servants intruding their personal affairs into my drawing room. Priscilla, if you are not satisfied here, I can arrange for your return to your mother. But if you are not even to bring in, but you are not ever to bring in street boys, horse boys, riffraff. You told me to fetch him. I did not tell you to fetch him in. Yes, you did. I said a clever metal worker. You came back with this boy, this saucebox, who couldn't do the work anyway because he... Johnny waited grimly for her to finish her sentence. If she dared say what was in her mind, because he has a crippled hand, he was going over and take her by her long throat and shake her, even if she did look pretty, well defended by his majesty's forces. Her eyes wavered, and she did not finish her sentence. Now, Cilla, I want you to go to your room and lie down. You are too tired. If you had not been, you would never have been so impudent as to contradict me. Yes, Miss Light. And you, she turned to Johnny, get back to the gutter or wherever boys like you keep themselves. Yes, Miss Light, he said, mimicking Cilla. Miss Bessie said nothing, but she evidently knew what had been going on in the drawing room. There, Johnny, she said mildly, you sit. This is not real tea, but I've put just a mite of brandy in it, and it's good and hot. Miss Laphams is just about making a monkey out of a Santa, he said at least. Nobody can make a monkey out of anyone who isn't a monkey to start with. Is Cilla happy here? Oh, happy enough. What do you expect? She knows she's lost to Santa. At first she used to cry, but now she accepts it. It's exciting for her, and there's always a flirting and going... At first she used to cry, but now she accepts it. It's exciting for her and her. There's always a flurry and goings on. The ball tonight. The next week we move out to Milton for the rest of the summer. We won't stay long. Why? Because the Sons of Liberty there are out to get Mr. Light. That's why they haven't yet been rough with the Tories out there. Hope to tempt him to move out, same as usual. They are going to get him and tar and feather him. They're going to ride Miss Laphams out of town on a rail. They're going to smash his great country house down once he's inside. But the girls, won't they get hurt? I'll be there. It's my secret, so I suppose I can tell you. But I'd take it kindly if you'll keep your mouth shut. If there were Daughters of Liberty, I'd be one. You ask Sam Adams about me. I've been helping him secretly for years. Johnny had taken it for granted that an old servant in a Tory house would also be a Tory. They usually were. He looked at Mrs. Bessie with admiration. The Lights will stay in Milton about a month, she whispered. You mark my words.